Introduction to Business, Chapter 11, Teamwork and Communication. The point of using teams is to get greater efficiency. If you have people working in a cohesive way together, they can produce more working together than they could on their own individually. So the quote that is attributed to Aristotle, although I couldn't really find proof that it's exactly what he said, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So if you take what a team is able to produce as a group, that could be a higher level of productivity than it would be if you just measured what everybody was doing individually in terms of output. I mentioned this in class. The thing that you need to be remembering is teams are great when they are well managed. If teams are not well managed or people don't have a good idea about what their roles are on the team, then you may actually end up with a contradictory view of how productive teams could be. There have been studies that found that poorly managed teams actually produce less than the individuals could have produced on their own because they spend most of their time trying to figure out what they're doing instead of actually working. When teams work really well and cohesively together, they can produce more than they could have individually. And in fact, sometimes teams are necessary to produce certain things that an individual would not be able to do. To manufacture a car involves several thousand moving parts. It would be too complicated for any one individual to figure out how to do it. So if you have a group of people working together, you can have a higher level of productivity. But the caveat there is that you need to be sure that the teams are well trained, that they're well managed, and they're put together appropriately. If you have a good team, you'll get better outcomes, more efficiency, faster productivity. You may have more thoughtful ideas, greater ingenuity, greater creativity, because if you have one person with a lot of good ideas and you match them together with another person with a lot of good ideas, those ideas will start to kind of coalesce into hybrid ideas that they wouldn't have been able to come up with on their own. A group is two people who are working together for common interests and they share an identity due to similar traits. If you just have a bunch of people standing together because they happen to like a particular type of music, that might be a group. You know, they went to a concert and they're all listening to the music and they're sitting near each other. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're a team, however. So a team is more managed. It's got more of a greater identity. You're putting together people with different skills and different tasks who operate together, knowingly working together towards a common goal. The different types of teams that we'll talk about a bit are self-managed, project teams, cross-functional, manager-led teams, and virtual teams. Self-managed teams are kind of the higher end of teams. You're not going to put someone who's never been on a team before with a bunch of other people who've never been on a team before at a lower level in the organization. You're going to have people that are probably higher, well-trained. They've worked together in teams before. They're familiar with the process. And they're so well adept at doing what they're supposed to be doing that you don't have to have a manager looking over their shoulder all the time. They are basically deciding what they're going to do. They are the ones that are responsible for the planning, the scheduling, the outputs, and all of the deliverables that they're required to come up with at the end of the task. As you can imagine, self-managed teams only work when you have people that are capable of self-management. If you've got people that are incapable of really working without supervision, that's not the type of person that you would want to put on a team. Project teams, a project has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and this type of work does occur during regular organizational routine business. Sometimes you may have a project to create a new product. You may have a project to come up with greater efficiencies. You may want to revise your HR department. Whatever it may be, you have to identify what a need is, come up with plans, figure out what people are going to do, work together, create whatever it is that the mission of the team was, and then have your deliverable issued for use of other people. At the end of the project, you should take a look at how well the team worked, how well the project was done, and whether or not any improvements could be made after the fact. So the next time you do a team, you'd be able to come up with better ideas to make it more efficient based on lessons learned from prior activities. Cross-functional teams are when you have people with different backgrounds that work together. This is the complementary that I mentioned in class, not with an I, but with an E, where they fit together. You have diversity of experience that can aid innovation, come up with ideas. As I said before, if you've got 3 or 4 people with individual ideas and you put them together, you may come up with 2 or 3 times that many ideas. And there would be ideas that they may not have been able to think about on their own because they can take pieces of each other's ideas and come up with something new. They're typically self-directed and they require input and expertise from different departments. So if you're going to create a new product, you want to find out how much money we have to spend. So maybe somebody from finance should be there. You want to know what's technologically capable of happening or being created. So you want to have somebody from R&D, research and development. You want to know how to sell the thing. Put somebody from marketing in there and do the advertising and even the creativity of all of the products. You can include people from there. So typically for large products or projects, you would have people that would work together. It's kind of like the matrix structure to a degree. You would be looking at people here in this example. You'd have somebody from project management, somebody from R&D, and different people from within the factory for productivity. And they pluck people out from each one of their roles and they put them together on a team to work together. That way you can avoid the silos. You see headquarters and R&D and factory are separate buckets in the organizational chart. It's called cross-functional because you're going across all of the borders of your organizational chart and putting people who may not typically work together on a team together. Manager-led teams are when the team members are doing the work, but somebody outside the team, a manager or a supervisor, is the one taking a look at the executive higher level deals. So they come up with the planning, the team comes up with questions, the manager leads them and guides them towards what they want to be doing. There can be some tension between how much the manager has to control over the team, how much say they have in the matter, and how much the team should be operating on their own. If you have people that did self-directed teams before working on a manager-led team, they may kind of buck against the authority there. So again, whenever you're creating a team, it's important to understand how to put it together in the way that's going to make the most effective and efficient outcome. Manager-led teams are typically efficient to the degree possible. If you have something that requires a lot of creativity, you don't necessarily want a manager-led team. You'd like to have people coming up with their own ideas rather than being told what to come up with. It kind of defeats the purpose of being creative. And while you do have more control and you can really make sure that the team is doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing, as I noted, if you've got somebody telling you what to come up with, then you're not going to be coming up with any ideas on your own. So it's a trade-off. That doesn't mean that one is worse than the other, either a manager-led or a self-directed team. It means that the management needs to figure out what it is that you're trying to accomplish and make sure that you use the appropriate team for the appropriate situation. Virtual teams are when you use people from a remote setting, so people using Zoom and Teams and other types of software through the internet, and maybe even phone calls, so that you can have people in different geographic locations using technology to bridge the gap so that they could work together. It does create a lot of flexibility, but you do lose something by not meeting in person. As we'll talk about later when we go over communications, it's not a very rich communications environment when you're never going to meet people face to face. You do lose a lot. Team development, they came up with this thing here where they almost rhyme: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, which isn't exactly the rhyme, but we get the point. Before everything's going to get going, you put things together and then you put the team together, you give them their tasks. They're going to have to figure out how to work together. They'll define what the tasks, whose roles are doing what the schedules are going to be, whatever other things that you need to get set up. What kind of equipment do we need? Do we need to have office space? Do we need to book rooms? Do we need to go off site? Do we need to get certain materials? Whatever all of those requirements happen, that's in the forming stage when you're putting things together. People meet each other. Typically, when you meet people for the first time, especially if you're on a cross-functional team and hadn't met them before, people tend to be on their best behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing. You don't want people to be angry and petty with one another, but you also don't want them to be holding their tongue when there's something that they think is wrong. They should be encouraged to speak up. But even if you tell the team that ahead of time in the forming session, you're basically just saying hi to everybody. So people will be on their best behavior. For storming, you're getting more into detail about how things are actually going to be done. The team members will work either independently because they have particular expertise. Some things they're going to have to work collectively. Whether they work on their own or collectively, they're going to have to come back and share it with the group. So a process for that has to be established. At this point, the introductions are over and people may start struggling because they think things should be a certain way and their teammates may think that their things should be a different way. So you can have a little bit of argumentation here. A little bit of controlled conflict is never a bad thing. When you avoid things like groupthink, which is when everybody is just saying yes, If you want to drive off a cliff, yes, because you want to do what's good for the team, so you just say yes, even if it's not really the thing that's the best. You want to have a group when you put people together in a team and you can tell them, listen, it's okay to have a disagreement, but you shouldn't be disagreeable. It shouldn't be your nature to just continually complain about things. If you have a good idea that is not being addressed, you can bring it up and people will look at it. And if it meets whatever criteria that your team has established, then you can go for it. If not, then you have to just suck it up and do what the team would want. But there has to be that opportunity for you to say, is this the right thing? In class, I mentioned about groupthink and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. The United States did something by trying to invade Cuba that was really not a good idea, but nobody ever stood up and said, this is a terrible idea, because they thought that they would be kind of highlighted as being not a team player. We also mentioned in class something about a devil's advocate. A devil's advocate is somebody who's actually assigned to look at maybe the downside of an idea. What could go wrong? Even if the entire team is on the same page and they all want to do this, if you assign somebody the duty to try to find out what's wrong with it, find the holes in the argument, they can do so and they won't even feel kind of anxious about it because that's expected of them. If you assign someone to be a devil's advocate, their role is to kind of be a pain, knowing that that's their role. You should be open and accepting to what they're saying, and they may bring up something that needs to be addressed. So again, being contentious is, if it's personal attacks, if it's somebody who's just never going to cooperate, that's problematic. But controlled conflict, where people understand that there is a role for conflict, that's okay. Norming is when things start to kind of get ironed out. People really get a feel for what they're trying to do. When you get things normalized, things start humming along because you don't have to invent the wheel every time. It's already been done. You may try it out and you may need to tweak a few things that you're doing, but you have a good expectation about how things are going to happen. The performing part comes once everything is established, and then there are really fewer time consuming distractions because you've really worked out all the difficult things in the beginning. And then you really get to the point where you're starting to do some output and probably see the end of the line in sight. And it does note here on this slide that while all four stages are distinct, sometimes they run into each other. And sometimes you have to go back and start over, or you have to revisit some of the storming and norming parts to make sure that the performing is going to be working correctly. The adjourning part is when the project is over, you basically start to wrap up, people get ready to go back to their other duties that they have within the organization. It's very important that you take a look after the project is complete and find out if it was successful. You have to have ways to measure if it's successful. And if there were problems, identify what they were so that the next time that you run some type of a project and have a team dealing with it, you'll be able to maybe pick a better team or figure out what types of things there are to avoid so that you are more improved and have more efficiency the next time around. Team success can often happen from training when you let people know what is exactly expected of them. You can establish modes of communication, make sure that they're all on the same team, that they're not going to be kind of backstabbing each other, or if you have competing teams, that the teams aren't going to be stealing resources from one another. If you have two teams that are doing the same type of work at the same time, there may be some conflict between the teams, and that's important for management to figure out how to make sure that they have everything that they need without having to scavenge or to cannibalize your own resources within the organization, because that's not going to help anybody down the road. Communication is basically giving information from one party to another through some type of medium of exchange, some way to communicate. When you talk about the media, TV, radio, etc., that is what a medium is. Media is simply a plural of medium, and a medium is something that can connect one thing to another. If anybody believes in psychics for whatever reason, a psychic medium is somebody who's supposed to be alive who can communicate with the afterlife. They're the medium to be able to get through there. And again, newspapers, all these other places, news reporting, they're called the media because under the Latin conjugation, media is plural of medium. So communications are important in business, obviously, because managers have to talk to workers, supervisors have to talk to managers, senior managers have to talk to line workers, however it is. We need to get information. We need to know how much money we're making. We need to know if there's any problems with the government. Do we have any consumer issues, other complaints? There's communication is basically the root of how an organization works. And if you have bad communication, you're not going to perform particularly well. You can use communication to promote your products, your services. You can get information about consumer behavior, do some outreach. Within the company, you have a lot of internal communications between employees and divisions and departments within the organization. I think we probably have an idea of what would good communication consist of, but there are a lot of barriers to communication. So the things you need to be paying attention to in business, it gets very easy to start making terms and using acronyms and using a lot of fancy jargon that doesn't really say a lot, but it sounds to some people like you know what you're talking about. Staying as simple as possible and getting to the point is usually preferable. You don't want people who withhold information. Sometimes people keep information because they're called gatekeepers. You know, they feel that maybe their job won't be as important if people don't have to rely on them to provide it. So they don't share information because they don't want to get fired if they tell somebody else what's how to do their job. If somebody else knows how to do their job, then maybe they don't need them anymore. The other reason that information may be withheld is sometimes it is actually confidential. If you work in HR, nobody else in the organization has to know what's in someone's HR file unless there's a reason to know. If a manager comes to me and says, you know, is this person, they've been out sick a lot, do they have, you know, some kind of disease? HR might know about that, but the manager doesn't necessarily have a right to know that information because it would be violation of someone's privacy. So privacy violations, you don't want to violate privacy, but at the same time, when things are not legally protected or confidential, you don't want people hanging on to information and not sharing it. You want to share as much information as possible. One thing you can do to stop the gatekeepers is to just let them know from management on down, it's okay to tell people how to do your job. Now, if you start firing people after other people figure out how to do their work, then it's not going to work. You have to have an organization, if you want to embrace open communications, you have to establish that and you have to walk the walk, as they say. If somebody does share information and they do help other people learn how to do their job, you need to be honoring their commitment to the job and let them stay around. Chain of command is important in communication. If you have a very high or tall organization where you have a lot of layers of management, if a lower level of management has to get approval for something, it has to go up through several chains or several steps. And that can create a barrier because if you're in a tall organization, you may have to go through three other managers before you can get an answer. If you're in a flatter organization, you may only have to go through one or two. But making sure that the communication just doesn't disappear. Sometimes it goes in somebody's email inbox and it just doesn't get responded to. And that's problematic. You can't get the information that you need to do your job because I don't know if I can do it or not. Having a lack of trust, sometimes the competitive culture within an organization can mean that different employees may not want to trust others. If you come up with a great idea, you may not want to share it with somebody because you suspect that they may steal your idea and take credit for it. Again, it's up to management to try and create an open and trusting organizational culture to try to combat that. There can be physical barriers of disabilities. People may have vision impairment, they may have hearing disabilities, they may have problems with speech. That can make communications difficult as well. There can be bias. You may listen to communication and only hear what you want because you have a preferred way of viewing things. There may be straight out racism. There may be other biases at play where people don't communicate correctly because of pre existing and preconceptions regarding stereotypes that they have. Any type of biased information is not good information. And if you're going to make a decision for a business, you need to have the best information possible. So try to eliminate bias to the degree that it's possible. It's critically important because if you have bias in your information, when you make a decision, you'll be making a biased decision as opposed to the correct, unbiased decision based on fact. That's very closely related to the next bullet about filtering. You can also have language and cultural differences. People may have different ways of speaking, colloquialisms. There may be regional dialects. You may have people from other countries who speak English as a second language. They may be unfamiliar with the way a particular organization communicates, and it may be shocking, even if you're all speaking the same language. It may just be a different style. When you're communicating, you use channels of communication, and we talk about rich channels and lean channels. Rich channels are the most interactive. They are the most robust ways of communicating to getting information to another. You have a sender and a receiver, and if you're in person, you get to see nonverbal communications as well. So those are rich channels because you're able to get a lot of the details around it. If you had a more lean channel, just say an email as opposed to a conversation in person, you're not going to be able to pick up on different cues to convey meaning about certain aspects of the message that's being sent. So the richest channels are face to face. in-person oral presentations, taking questions. Rich channels are online meetings and video conferencing. It's the next best thing at this point to being in person. Lean channels are telephone calls, teleconferences, voice messages. Leanest channels are just blogs, report, tweets, texts, emails, etc. I mentioned in class the whole reason we have emojis is so that people can tell a joke and not make someone angry, because when you just see things in black and white text, you don't often get the context of what's going on. If you're somebody like me who's very sarcastic, that's usually when you say one thing that is the opposite of what you actually mean. But if you just write it out, people will not know if you're kidding or not. So you have to put a little smiley face at the end of it to try and make that lean channel a little bit more rich. Types of communications channels, most of you are obviously already familiar with it. Web-based, emails, letters, presentations, telephone, face-to-face. How do you choose a channel? It really depends on the type of message that you're trying to get out there. If I'm at work and the elevators are out, I suppose I could send an email. I maybe even just put a sign on the door. That's communicating something that's probably sufficient. If I have something that's a little bit more nuanced, if there's an announcement regarding a new product that we're doing and we have to change the way we're doing our business processes, you may not want to just do an email for that. You may want to meet people either online or in person so that they can ask questions and have some feedback. So the complexity of the message really depends on the complexity of the situation that you're trying to address. If it's a complicated situation, you should allow a richer, more complex use of communication so that people will have the information that they need to go forward. Communication flows typically go either up, down, or sideways. In this case, downward, upward, horizontally, which is sideways to peer within the organization. You may also have diagonally, where a lower level person in one department talks to a higher level person on another department. All of those are internal. The last category is external, and that could be to government agencies, it could be to consumers, it could be to the press, it could be to any party that has any reason to have interaction with your company. Going through the types of communication flows, downward is from leaders and managers to share information at lower level. Upward is from lower level to higher ones. Typically, it's going through managers, and maybe if you have something that needs to go to their manager, then you have this whole channel of communication that we were talking about previously. Horizontal communications is sideways or lateral communication. It's usually people at the same level talking to one another. So people who are working in the accounting department, all of the accountants who are in the same group, they will talk to each other about what they're working on. Diagonal communication is, again, it's almost like this matrix sense in terms of talking to other people in different groups from different levels. And then, as I mentioned before, external communications is anybody outside, and you'll have to address that audience differently depending on who you're talking to. You're not going to talk to a law firm the same way you're going to talk to your customers. Formal communication versus informal communication. Formal communication is kind of the party line, the company line. You've got the managers that are saying the way things should be. Oftentimes, however, you have informal communication where people are talking at lunch or around the water cooler, as they say, and what they really say to each other is informal communication. It's not the type of thing you would want maybe to put in a memo to your boss, but you have to understand that there is both the formal communication where the CEO says, this is what we're going to do, and then the informal communication, which is what the employees actually are talking to each other about. If you're a manager, you have to realize that there is the so-called grapevine where people talk to each other and they pass along rumors. You could have a formal stance in communication, but what people are actually saying could be a little bit different. So keeping your ears open and understanding what people are talking about, you may be surprised what you find out what they're actually saying as opposed to what the party line and the company line is. Formal communication typically comes from higher level to lower level. It can be shaped by the hierarchy of those chain of command. There's also things regarding technology and how are you going to be meeting with one another. Typically, formal communication is documented. We'll send out an email to everybody. We'll know what it was. If we're sending out a memo to people, we'll date it. We'll keep it on file. It's often one way because it's communicating something that the higher end of the organization wants people to be aware of and to have them behave in a way that they're communicating to them. Informal communication can be multi-directional. I can have a formal communication where my boss sends me a memo, but I can also just talk to my boss outside of a meeting and say, hey, between you and me, this is what we think. This is typically separate from workflows. It can involve work. It can involve things outside of work. So oftentimes those things get kind of merged together. You do have a lot of risk with communications, especially in the modern age where you have viruses and worms and people hacking into your computer system. Spoofing is when they pretend to be Amazon and they send you an email and they tell you to give me your password because there's a problem with it. Same thing with phishing. If anybody ever got the email from the Nigerian prince who's still looking for somebody to cash his checks, that's kind of an example of that. You may have people who are able to get access because someone at work opens up an email and they click on something that infects the entire network. So your emails may be stolen by other people. The information may be hard. You may not be able to use your email as a result of it. So IT and communications really need to be kind of married together a little bit to make sure that any information problems that pop up, they're able to be addressed. There's also ethical issues that you should consider. I mentioned earlier, you do not want to be communicating information that is private. If you are a manager, you don't want to be giving out confidential information, or if you are in a publicly traded company, you don't want to be telling other people to sell their stock because you know that the stocks are going to be dropping. That's known as insider trading. So that is not only unethical, it is illegal. So you have to be careful about how that plays out. But you may also have information about employees. Somebody may be out on family and medical leave because their wife has cancer. That's really nobody else's business except HR. If they are approved for that time off, Bob in accounting doesn't have to know why this person is out. You should not be sharing that type of information. It would be unethical to do so. And it may actually be illegal as well, depending on the nature of the information that's shared. A lot of companies collect information from their consumers and they use that to find out what types of products they might want to buy, but they also, as a source of primary investigation to collect information, they may bundle that all together and sell it to other people in marketing in order to make money from the information that they've collected. Companies like Facebook, they don't actually charge you to use it, but that doesn't mean it's free. They are harvesting information about everything that you click on, and they are trying to build a profile about who you are and what type of person you are and what things you might want to be interested in, and they sell that to advertisers. And that is going to cover teamwork and communications. We're going to be doing chapter 4 next.